Ever get that, like, instant wave of offense? You know, someone cuts you off in traffic or a coworker makes a kind of snide remark,
Oh, yeah.
and suddenly, bam, you're just offended.
Like a button.
It is like a
Yeah.
universal button, and it feels like it's getting pushed way too easily these days.
Yeah.
But what if, and this is a big what if, but what if we had a choice about it? Like, what if we could choose not to be offended?
Mm.
That's what we're diving into today, this idea that we might actually have more control over our reactions than we think.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept. It kind of challenges what a lot of us assume, that being offended is just automatic.
Right.
Like it's involuntary. Like you said, someone pushes that button.
Exactly.
But the material we're looking at today, it says, no, it's not a reflex. It's actually a choice.
And that is a powerful shift in perspective, right?
It is.
Because if it's a choice, then we have agency.
Definitely.
It's not, this person made me feel this way.
Yeah.
It's, okay, this happened, and now I can decide how I want to respond.
Absolutely. And the article really emphasizes how empowering that realization can be.
Yeah.
You know, it puts you back in the driver's seat, so to speak, of your own emotions.
Okay, but how often do we actually do that? Like, how often do we actually pause in those moments of, like, anger or frustration to make that conscious choice?
Right.
It feels like we're almost hardwired to react defensively.
It definitely takes practice. It's not easy, and that's why the article doesn't suggest we, like, deny our feelings altogether. It acknowledges that, no, our feelings are always valid. They're our truth.
Right.
But, and this is key, they're not necessarily the truth. Our emotions, they're as real as they feel in the moment, but they don't always reflect what's actually objectively true about a situation.
That seems like such a huge distinction, especially when we're talking about conflicts or disagreements, right?
Exactly.
Just because I feel a certain way doesn't automatically mean that the other person is in the wrong.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of choosing not to be offended can be so helpful, especially in navigating those tricky interpersonal waters. Imagine if you could approach a disagreement not from a place of, like, you offended me, but more from a place of curiosity.
Yeah.
Like, help me understand where you're coming from. It just
Gotcha.
totally transforms the dynamic.
So how do we actually apply this, in the real world?
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to say don't be offended,
Right.
but, like, life is constantly throwing curveballs at us.
Yeah, it gives us plenty of opportunities to practice that, right?
It does.
And the article actually gives a really good example of this dealing with criticism at work.
Okay.
They call it the criticism feedback loop, which I thought was a really interesting way to frame it.
I like that. The criticism feedback loop. Okay, so how does it work?
So picture this. Someone criticizes your work,
Ouch.
right? And that first thing you probably feel is that sting of being offended,
Yep.
maybe even getting defensive or hurt. But here's the thing. Instead of reacting right away, you pause. You analyze why it is that you're feeling hurt.
Okay.
Like, are you upset because deep down you know the criticism is valid,
Right.
even if it wasn't delivered in the nicest way? Or is it maybe triggering some deeper insecurity that you have? And that moment, that self-reflection, that's where the real growth can happen.
Interesting. Because instead of focusing on that other person, the person who's delivering the criticism, you're kind of taking ownership of your own reaction to it
Exactly.
and choosing to maybe learn from that experience, even if it's initially uncomfortable.
Yeah, you said it. It's about shifting from that knee-jerk reactivity to self-awareness.
Yeah.
And to help us navigate those situations a little bit better, the article actually outlines a really practical 4-step process.
Ooh, I love a good process. Lay it on me.
All right, so step 1, recognize.
Okay.
And this is just simply acknowledging that feeling of offense, but without any judgment. You know, just, okay, I'm feeling a little triggered right now.
Right.
Just noticing it.
Awareness, always a good step 1. All right, what's next?
Next, we separate. And this is where you're actively working to separate that initial emotion from what's objectively true about the situation.
Okay.
Is this really about them, what they said, or is this about something you're carrying around inside? You know, like, did their comment touch on maybe a fear of failure that you've always had? It's not really about them then, is it?
Right.
That's about you.
Not taking it personally, even when it feels so personal. Man, that's a tough one.
Oh, it is. It takes practice. But that's where step 3 comes in. Decide.
Yeah.
This is where you consciously choose how you want to respond. And not based on that initial wave of feeling offended, but from this place of hopefully greater understanding.
So we've recognized it. We've separated it from, like, the objective truth. We're deciding on a response. What's the final step?
Forgive.
Forgive.
And this isn't necessarily about the other person. It's about releasing yourself from carrying around that negative emotion. Because let's face it, holding on to offense, it only hurts you in the long run.
Right.
So,
It only hurts you to hold on to it. But this idea of choosing emotional freedom, as the article calls it,
eh,
that feels, I don't know, kind of like next level stuff. What's that actually look like day to day, you know?
it's a good question. It's kind of getting at, like, what does it really mean to move through the world, like, consciously? And the article actually ends on this provocative question it asks. Can we get to a point where we're just less easily offended?
Hmm.
Like those buttons we were talking
Yeah.
about earlier.
Yeah.
Maybe they just become a little less sensitive.
But is that even something we want? Like, don't we need a certain amount of offense to, I don't know, fuel positive change in the world, to stand up to injustice?
Right.
I mean, think about, like, social movements or speaking out against harmful behavior. That all comes from a place of, like,
Yeah.
moral outrage. Right.
You bring up a really important point, and it's not about becoming indifferent to when bad things happen.
Right.
Or developing some kind of, like, super thick skin where nothing bothers you.
Right.
It's more about recognizing that even when those offenses happen, because they will, we still have a choice. There's a difference between being, like, totally hijacked by our immediate impulsive reaction
Right.
and, taking a breath and then deciding how we actually want to use our energy.
So it's less about silencing those emotions and more about being, I don't know, more skillful in how we use them.
Yes,
'Cause, like,
exactly.
we can still feel anger, we can still feel frustration, but it doesn't have to control us.
Exactly. And that's where the real power of all this lies, right? It puts us back in the driver's seat of our own, emotional lives.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean we'll never be caught off guard or feel a flash of anger or frustration again, but it gives us more tools to work with those feelings in a way that's hopefully more helpful and productive.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive. It's really got me thinking about all the choices, big and small, that we're making every single day. Not just in how we react to the people around us, but, like, what kind of emotional world we're creating in here.
So to you, listening right now, here's a question kind of take with you as you go about your day. What would it actually look like for you to experience a greater sense of that emotional freedom? How would that show up in your relationships, in your work, your interactions with, well, just the world in general? It's something worth, playing around with, experimenting with, because honestly, who knows? Maybe choosing not to be offended is the key to unlocking a whole other level of peace and, honestly, effectiveness in our lives.